Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Triangle Area SQL Server User Group's Shop Talk. We have with us an entire cast and crew. So, to answer Lysanki's question, who's on double secret probation? Even the cat is here. So we have everybody. Let's start with the cat. Welcome. And,
Quake.
along with Tracy Baggiano.
Quake and Tracy, yes. Her last name is Ramos, though.
That makes sense. Next to Tracy and co-pilot, Mala Mahadevan. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here.
And
Sweet.
over in that corner, wearing the blue trunks, Mike Christensen.
Hello, everybody.
So, rough idea of Shop Talk, in case this is your first time here, welcome. This is just a way of, you know what, the weekend is over, but we can still kill a little bit of time. You have questions, we might have answers. We have questions, you might have answers. We'll have a little bit of a chat. We've got a few topics for tonight, but as always, this is chat driven. We welcome hearing questions from you as well as seeing what's on your mind. Tim Matheson must have given a pep talk. There we go. That could have done it. First up, this actually comes in from Mala, and it is a actually before that. See, I'm jumping ahead in my show notes. Past Summit. Past Summit is coming up, what, 5 months from now?
November.
So 6 months from now. Time to get planning for it. And if you use the discount code Azure175, you will save $175 off of your registration for Past Summit, which will be in person this year in Seattle, Washington. There is also a virtual option. So Azure175 is the discount code. Save $175 off of registration. Now we get to the link from Mala, and this comes from the SQL Server Reddit. Pedro Alvarez asked what I think is an interesting question, and it was the question, does the principle of least privilege actually exist in SQL Server? And the question is a bit tongue-in-cheek, and I think it gets to a rather interesting point. The premise of the question is, if an auditor comes in and demands least privilege, what does least privilege actually mean? And are you actually providing least privilege? For every shop where everybody has SA, where everyone's a sysadmin, where there are hundreds of DB owners who just kind of own everything, probably not following least privilege. Most likely, the janitor does not need sysadmin on that SQL Server instance. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, sell me on it, but I'm probably not. Probably not. And least privilege exists nowhere in its full embodiment. Yeah, that nihilist approach, if you want to go far enough, I fully agree with you. And so I consider it a principle to which we strive rather than a place in which we are. I could give the argument that least privilege does exist in computer networks. If you turn off all of the computers, bury all of the computers with sand, shoot everybody who's involved in the company, in that case, you probably have least privilege. But that might, I don't know, that may not go very well with police. They typically don't take a kind approach to gunning down all of your employees. Typically don't. So not recommended. That is not a Shop Talk recommendation. Army, Navy, and Marines all give techs full access to everything so they can do actual work for their superiors. Yeah, I don't have any experience directly with that. I have worked with and talked to people who have worked in the armed forces and have worked on computer networks in there. I know that given that there are differing levels of networks where you have more sensitive data that goes on certain networks and stays off of others, you're going to have radically different permission sets there. But even then, I would expect that, yes, it's not limited to just the people, the bare minimum number of people who need to see the bare minimum amount of information. This is how I learned drop equals delete. Well, Mike, that's a good lesson to learn.
Okay.
And a good one for the DBAs to learn to not let me have it.
Truncate.
Partition-
No,
What's that?
I know, but
Don't drop and delete. Just truncate.
Well, I mean, Mike probably had foreign key constraints he had to worry about, and
and the table I deleted was like an orders table. It wasn't like a lookup table, right? Or, it was very naughty, very naughty.
if you're gonna mess up, go big. That is shop talk advice. If you're gonna mess up, go big.
Change all the customers' addresses to yours. That way, when everything ships, you get all the stuff.
For other pro tips, follow us at.
I was a drug company, so I'm sure I'd go to jail pretty fast.
Partitioning security is very important, and understanding what exactly is it that people have access to, especially when you're at working with a larger system. When you're at that startup level, I only have a couple of products. I don't have a big database. I don't have a lot of things. It's easier to understand who has access to what, how can they access things. But when you're coming in as a new DBA in an established organization that may have thousands of employees, that has dozens of databases, that has hundreds or thousands of tables, it can be rather daunting to try to understand who really needs access to these things and carving away access that already exists. I think that's one of the biggest problems. Tracy and Mala, you've both worked as DBAs. How do you even start that kind of thing? Tracy, you were once a DBA one time, that one day.
One day? What did I do that one day?
That's the real question.
What was the question again? The cat
So-
was distracting me.
That's okay.
I'm trying to get her off the here.
So you walk into a shop and it's very obvious that principle of least privilege is nowhere near being followed. By the way, Mala, we cannot hear you. You might have to refresh. Yeah. So how do you?
So you're talking about that one company where like everybody knew the SA account, including
Yeah, kind of like that.
the person who answered the telephones at the front desk.
Yes, kind of like that. Yeah.
That place.
Yeah. How
I
do
left
you?
9 months later because
all right,
they
that's-
wouldn't let me change anything.
That's a problem. Yeah.
But seriously, I tried to set up like database roles and put like people's accounts on there, like the Windows accounts, and tried to lock down permissions to where they could just read the data. Just as a starting point, they could read anything. Didn't care what they could read at that point because it was just like anything besides SA. And then I was gonna start locking down stuff inside the application because the application logged in as SA. Because that was the only
As it
account
does.
that was on the server was SA. It really was.
Yeah,
It was-
and you
terrible.
inevitably end up with something where it's like, oh, well, we need to do bulk inserts from the application, so I need grant control on the database.
Yeah. I've had that before. Yes. They needed the truncate table needs DDL admin.
Yeah.
So then they have permissions, to change the structures of everything.
Yep. And so I think that's probably the biggest realistic limitation to really getting to principle of least privilege, that certain pieces of functionality which are potentially important for an application come with them the capacity to do a lot more. There is no grant truncate that allows you just to truncate and not to do any of the other DDL operations. So now you can drop a table. You can create a table.
alter the table types. You
Correct.
can,
Yep.
add columns, and then all of a sudden, you
I've
select stars that insert and stuff start breaking because people use select stars instead of specifying columns. And all of a
I was-
sudden, things are not magically working anymore.
Yeah, and I have this new responsibility where I have these data science users that are in a contained environment, and I give them views that I control, and we're very careful about with grant option versus which we never use because we got to be careful because we can't give them access to some of the Epic proprietary data. So the chaos engineering that you all brought up recently has been interesting because as I've connected people using different tools like SPSS or R Studio, and I walk clients through it, I can see that they have more access than I thought they had sometimes. So
Yeah.
it's actually been a good experience to kind of to have these different things come up where I can actually see the effect of some of the privileges and roles that are in effect because it gives me an immediate action item to fix because we don't want them to see some of those things or inadvertently just poke around or break something. And so yeah, it's something that we think about a lot, and it's very, very useful.
One company I worked at, they literally had basically SSMS built into the application so that customers could change data types and add columns onto the tables themselves without any. So everything was different everywhere. It was a nightmare. That was the same company where everybody had SA. I was only there 9 months.
As a business side, I can always sometimes see when you like we had I had a friend who was a customer of another company that was kind of a column store, and anytime they needed to change something, they had to put in a ticket, they had to call their service provider. They couldn't really do much. So I can see where they're like the pendulum swings, like give us all access because we pay for it and da, da, da. But like obviously you have to meet in the middle because nothing's
And
gonna
there's
work.
a different way to do that than edit the actual table, because then when we go to make changes, we might overwrite their changes and break their stuff if we're adding functionality. We could overwrite something that they did and break what they did and to add our stuff. It was just like in trying to get them to understand this and try to rein it in. I was getting nowhere, and they wouldn't let me change a thing anywhere for 9 months. Nothing. I couldn't get them to let me do anything, so it drove me bananas. Literally. So I couldn't do it anymore. So I seen a tweet and left.
Yeah, no, that's a scenario where all right, they're not going to accept it. Move on.
Yeah, basically. And it was basically I was working for a developer manager, and the operations manager wasn't letting me do stuff, and the developer manager didn't really get me involved in stuff until like 7 months in. And I was trying to do operations stuff to make things faster, and he wouldn't let me do anything because it was not a good situation. And they
That
just
makes the
didn't take
operations manager
recommendations
look
for
bad.
anything. So
Looking at chat.
It was
Yeah,
bad.
no, that's bad scenario.
Security.
Yeah. Like
It's
Yankee
just as
says,
bad back in 2000 before they introduced you had to put passwords into SA. Remember when we used to have blank SA passwords by default? The good old days.
no, that is.
Those are the good old days. You could get into any system, man. Any of them. I remember starting jobs and just like finding servers and just logging into them. Magic.
Yeah, well, prior to 2005 SP1, you could sniff the password from SQL authentication if you had a packet sniffer. So you would be able to get that first. You'd be able to get the login process, and that was fixed, I think, SP1. But welcome back, Mala.
Thank
You sound like a robot, but we heard you.
So catching up on chat, Lysanki mentioning that in most security presentations that lack of least privilege, the principle of least privilege is the root cause of most security failures, often scoffed at by those wanting to talk about expensive monitoring software. I mean, now that we're sponsored by, we're not sponsored by anybody. Although if expensive monitoring software wants to throw a bunch of money at us, I mean, we probably still wouldn't take it. But
Just go read my blog post on writing stick audits.
this is why, see, Tracy, this is why we can't get nice advertiser money.
Hey, I wrote it today. It went into Brent Ozark's newsletter. It must be worth something.
Yeah.
What did you write, Tracy?
A SQL audit for doing stick compliance for the government.
Oh, okay.
Fun stuff. I've been doing security compliance for 2 years now. I know
Yeah,
more
I
about
know.
security compliance than I ever wanted to know. Ever.
Although I don't think I prefer that way of learning via audits. I audits and don't miss them at all. Not the least bit.
And I tell you, a good resource for it too is Solomon from our user group, because I used stuff off his blog to help me get my filters correct on my audit. So he's gotten a few clicks on his blog today. I've seen from my WordPress stats.
Speaking of Solomon, the next comment in chat here, hate to sound like a broken record, but moduleassigning.info is how to get to least privilege. It's how you can get to much less privilege. I mean, least privilege is as much process as it is tooling. And you'll never get to least privilege if you don't have a full understanding of what everybody actually needs. Because the whole point is, if you don't need it, you don't get it.
Yes.
But
I vote
once
for stored procedures.
Yeah.
That's the only way you access data and do anything with data is through stored procedures.
That does help a lot.
Views. Yeah, we use a lot of views.
But even then, if I have the capacity to deploy a stored procedure arbitrarily,
No,
then
you can't do that.
Why not?
Because we're locking that down to only the DBAs.
Okay, so there's a mechanism by which somebody can deploy it. Now, if I pay a DBA enough money, I mean, this sounds like it's a joke, but in all seriousness, this was our review of Lapsus a couple weeks ago, which was they would pay people, here, $10,000, swap out your SIM card, because that allowed them to log on to a network. So yeah, at that point, if there's a
way, basically.
Right. If it's important enough, and I have enough money, probably going to happen. And that's why security, the whole concept of security has moved away from prevent the barbarians from getting through the gates to instead assume that there's already an attacker on your network. Now what do I do? And trying to find ways to figure out where they're at, trying to find out what they can do, what they have done, and shutting them down as quickly as possible, instead of trying to build up a wall or a moat to prevent somebody from getting in. So that whole mental posture has changed, and has been marketingized to zero trust, which I don't trust that. But that's neither here nor there. And Lysanki does mention that, for example, with principle of least privilege, you could create a document that you're not allowed to distribute. Yeah, you can write to a medium that you're not allowed to read from. So that is technically possible, and there are practical reasons why you might want to be able to do that in the realm of auditing. That you should be able to write information out and assume that you'll never need to read it again. But that is a type of thing that can be very difficult to implement in practice. Just a thing we got to deal with, basically. It does take effort and discipline. Go ahead, Mike.
Would that be if example of like I can technically send an email to 30,000 Duke employees? Is that what they mean? Like, I'm not really supposed to, or quote unquote allowed to, but I could send a rant to like 30,000 employees if I wanted to. Is that what you mean, kind of, or is that?
No, not like that. I mean, that's a great way to lose a job. But instead, think of it as more of I am sending out a signal, and my process should not be allowed to read what that signal is. I can write it, but I can't go back and read it after the fact. So because I can't, somebody impersonating me cannot. And that's where that concept comes in, that I am the writer. I am the person who is translating or who is scribing the message, but I don't need to be able to see that message after the fact. It has already been sent, and therefore providing me the ability to read it later is a potential security issue. Each letter in CRUD is controlled. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, that you should be able to manage who is able to perform each of these steps. Where I would say is you could potentially get even more granular than create, read, update, delete, because there's also the concept of within read, should I be able to read all of these attributes that are on a table? So should I, for example, be able to decrypt some encrypted information? Like say we need to collect a credit card number. So we're encrypting the credit card number versus hashing it because we need to be able to transmit that credit card number to a third party. Should my user be able to decrypt that credit card number? And the answer to that may differ from should my user be able to read from the payments table? So there can be one set of users for which the answer is yes, read from the payments table and decrypt the credit card number. But then there's a whole separate set who are read from the payments table, but you're not allowed to see the decrypted credit card number. So yeah, there's within this creation concept, there are finer grained notions. And tying back to SQL Server, there is a lot that you can do, but in practice, it's not the technology, it's the people and the process. And the people in the process are they're the biggest flaw. The technology doesn't matter which technology you're working with for the most part. There usually are mechanisms. It's whether or not those mechanisms are compatible with people, whether or not those mechanisms are compatible with process, that makes the significant difference. Who writes the tables and can they make it work? So who writes to a table could be a totally different process, could be a totally different person. Who can make it work? Well, nobody. That's why they made SA everywhere. The developers gave up after 20 minutes and we can't figure it out, so we're just going to make everyone sysadmin. That seemed to fix the problem.
My favorite thing is when I used to do consulting is the number of places where they would actually name an ID something like read only, and then you actually go and see what that thing does, and you'd see check marks on everything like one by one, so you can see how it got there, and finally it's actually sysadmin called read only, but it didn't get there overnight. It's like, okay, today the guy thinks one more check off, and then another thing, and then another thing, and finally it's done, and it's like sysadmin. And that read only is now sysadmin.
That does happen, yeah.
Yeah, so many places have that. So many places.
Yep, where you slowly break down those walls and say,
right.
I could learn to do this the right way. I could implement this the right way, or I can do this the easy way. And the problem is there's only so many times that, you can take the time to learn it the right way, that you can implement it the right way, before someone eventually says, oh, we need it done right now. We have a prod down emergency. And so we need to give everybody sysadmin to fix this problem. The devs said it, we just got to do it. And then, oh yeah, we'll get that fixed on the backlog. It's a difficult situation, especially in an existing organization. Small organizations, it can be a lot easier to deal with because you have more influence, you have more control. If there is somebody who is at the top who actually cares about this stuff, you can get things pretty close to right. But once you start introducing 3 layers of management, 4 layers of management, 5 layers, once you start talking about 3, 4, 5-digit numbers of employees, at that point, we're now looking at how difficult it is to fix a system that has evolved in such a way that security has never even been a thought. Reminds me that IBM, we secured the lab network and nobody could do anything. That lasted about 4 minutes. Yeah, exactly. Once you do it, well, gotta go. I've been on cases where we have tightened down networks. In a lot of cases, it was due to regulations that, well, guess what? We can't not do this. Regulatory requirements force our hand here. And in those scenarios, part of the, the approach that seems to be successful is getting people to understand, look, failure is going to happen. We're not going to get it right the first time. All right, we can spend 6 hours talking about exactly what permissions are necessary, what things are here, but regardless, still going to find some problems. And that's where, okay, you found a problem. If we can make it very clear that this is in fact due to the security change, and have a quick path to get in touch with the people who are responsible for the security change and say, hey, here's my problem right now, that can help resolve a lot of potential pain points without just flipping open the gates. So an example was I helped with basically a network lockdown at an agency I used to work for, and we spent a couple of weeks trying to understand exactly which servers needed which ports for what traffic, lock everything else down. Now, over the course of the next couple of weeks, we would find some things that, oh, yeah, this traffic actually is legitimate. Okay, well, let's tamp that down a bit. Oh, this traffic is legitimate. Okay, let's open that combination. But it's working with people, and it's trying to instill that notion of some limited amount of grace in the activity, that yes, this is not working right now, but we will fix this very quickly. That I think goes a long way to helping make an actual lockdown more successful. But otherwise, it is really difficult to tighten security controls that are loose. It's a lot easier to go the other way. That ratchet goes. It's not a real one-way ratchet, but it sure feels like it sometimes. Sneak the data out on a thumb drive hidden in a coffee cup. I mean, we're not talking about movie-style drug lord things where all the employees get heavily searched every day when they're done. If you're in an environment where that data is that important, that sensitive,
You won't be able to plug in a thumb drive.
that's true. Actually, so my agency.
If you do that here, it like your computer like freaks out.
Yeah, exactly.
I did it. I had some photos, like personal photos, I was just putting, and I was like, oh, I better write an email to the IT to tell them what I did. Because it was like, it was like a movie. It was like my computer was being taken over. It was like, you inserted a USB drive.
How dare you?
Boop, 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 boop.
Right.
Mine got mad. My computer got mad at me for plugging up my Stream Deck. Well, I plugged it into my docking station for my personal laptop, but then my work computer uses the same docking station, so it just automatically installed the software. I didn't know it even did it. It just did it, and they like. So I'm like, I have to remember to unplug it before I plug in my work computer when I use it for my personal stuff. It's insane.
Yeah, Yeah, and I did say an agency, but this isn't a TLA. This actually was a 6-letter agency, so it was not nearly as strict as a TLA. You need to rip stuffing.
What is a TLA, Kevin?
3-letter acronym, or in this case, 3-letter
sorry,
agency.
Sorry. Yeah.
You'd need to rip the stuffing out of an OS to prevent thumb drives. Well, most run software on the drive to tell them how to treat the device. This is true.
Exactly.
And this was actually a problem for a long time with Windows with auto run, because you could make auto run a batch file when you plug in a thumb drive. And so, hey, treat this as an executable and go install my malicious software because you plugged in a thumb drive. That eventually was taken out as the default. So you have to go through a couple of steps to actually automatically run something like that on a thumb drive, because Windows got burned a few times in that regard. So yeah, that is usually, though, we have third-party antivirus software, stuff like Carbon Black, that tracks thumb drive access and can prevent action, so rather than at the OS level. But yeah, that was a fun story about least privilege, and I think my big takeaway there, or my big giveaway there, is sit down for this. Least privilege is hard. Actually,
Very hard, yeah.
it's impossible, but it's worth trying to approach. Asymptotically approaching. Now, the problem is some people are way on the fat side of the asymptotic tail. Not too many are down on the thin side of the asymptotic tail. But, it's worth shifting a little bit over there. So next, this comes from Mike, and I am labeling this section, Bro, do you even grouping sets? And unfortunately, I don't have this fantastic flowchart to walk through to find out that you don't, in fact, grouping sets. So the question from Mike is, hey, do people use cube, rollup, and grouping sets when they're grouping things in SQL Server? Which, I want to bounce this first to our audience. Since, Mike, you asked the question, do you ever use cube, rollup, or grouping sets? And why is it grouping sets? Because grouping sets is the best.
So I don't. I have used them when I was working on the 2012 book. So I use them in examples, but I haven't used them. And then I've been working on this one, which has got some really good performance stuff, and they're referencing them. And there's value in using the model clause group by roll up cube for performance reasons.
So Mike has just tendered his resignation from the SQL Server users group.
No. I have the Microsoft one too. This one is just somebody threw this at my desk and it just landed right here, and
right.
I was like,
I can see it's like he's got a tawdry magazine in the front and the Oracle book behind it. I'm definitely not reading Oracle book here. So yeah, of those, you mentioned model, and that's not even in T-SQL, but there probably is something similar in fashion. But sticking in the T-SQL world, cube I don't like. I have used rollup. Rollup gives you basically one record per every level of aggregation in your data set. Cube gives you one record for every combination of points aggregated, every combination of columns that you can aggregate. And grouping sets allows you to control what levels you want to aggregate. So like Solomon mentions, using grouping sets to get the grand total as a final row. That's a really good use for it. You could get, let's say that I have, should you tell noobs what this stuff is? I just did. I even did little finger things. If the finger things don't work, I'm all out of ideas. So So, all right, Mr. Lysanki, I will give you a little bit of a more detailed discussion and say that, roll up, cube, and grouping sets are all roll up, cube, and grouping sets are all ways of aggregating data. They are ways of working with the group by clause. So you have group by some attributes, and you can with roll up, with cube, with grouping sets. With roll up, so let's say that I have 4 columns. Maybe I've got the country, the product, the salesman, and the amount sold. And I want to group, I've got all of those different rows that have those 4 attributes. This is orders data that Mike dropped earlier in the show. And we want to group this data. So I could group with rollup, grouping by my product, my country, my salesperson. And rollup is going to show me the combination, basically like here is each country, individual country, and everything else. Those will be nulls. Each salesperson, each product, each in Rollup's case, it's going to show me country, product, because that was the order, then country, product, salesperson, because that's the order in which I laid them out in the query. So it's intended really for hierarchical style queries. So it works even better if you have, say, country, state, city. With rollup, works really well. I can now roll up by country and state, by country, state, and city. And cube, by contrast, is going to give you basically every combo. So going back to country, person, and product, it's going to give you country and product, country and person, person and product, the combination of the 3. Well, once you have 5 or 6 columns on here, you have a huge number of results coming back in cube. So it's exactly like you write a tabular printout of the data. Rollup is like a tabular printout, yes. Cube is like a tabular printout, except that the person doesn't know what they're doing and gets paid by the line. And grouping sets gives you control. So you could have a grouping set that is country, a grouping set that is country and person, and a grouping set that is all of them. So now I'll see 1 row per country, 1 row per country and salesperson, and 1 total. All 3 of those have their uses. Like I said, I don't like cube at all. I have never used it naturally in a business purpose. You can get to cube and to rollup from grouping sets. Grouping sets is the more complicated, the more complex bit of functionality, but it offers you a lot more power. So that's your trade-off. I think the trade-off is well worth it in the case of grouping sets. I 100% endorse grouping sets. I will use rollup if I know that I need exactly what rollup provides, but generally, I want grouping sets. That's going to give me more control over my data, especially if the data is not hierarchical, which rollup doesn't like to handle very much. Rollup is definitely great with hierarchical data, less great with non-hierarchical data. Like a graph of data with purpose. Yeah, and cube is a graph of data without purpose. Like I said, that's the Charles Dickens of result sets, where you get paid by the chapter.
I love that comparison, Kevin. Great one.
So that's grouping sets, and I think grand totals as a final row, definitely a useful case for a grouping set, because you can have all of your normal groups, and then you have just that one final total. And you can also handle the ordering of the grouping sets as well. So you could say, show in the order where you see everything else and then the final row. And so that way the data output ends up how you want it to look in your output table, in your Excel table, in Power BI, in reporting services, and whatever.
That's helpful. I'm gonna try to practice those.
Yeah, grouping sets is worth learning, practicing, and when you're working a lot in reporting, especially, is where grouping sets make sense. When you're working mostly in transactional processing, grouping sets has occasionally crept in, but it's pretty rare. Usually, it's a lot more common if I need to do periodic reporting. So that's the area I'd be looking at. So next up, also from Mike. Mike's got 2 topics today. What kind of hardware would you use for practicing SQL Server work? So you're getting involved with some training, some SQL Server training, right, Mike?
Yes.
And that's mostly around query tuning?
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially I bought the Black Friday sale of Brent. Last name starts with an O, rhymes with Omar. And
It's okay to say Brent Ozar.
okay,
we're not
okay.
sponsored by Brent either, so if you
You
want to
can
throw
go
a bunch
right
of money
ahead,
for
Mike.
advertising,
Yeah.
So I think that at a kind of beginner intermediate level, and I write a lot of queries, but like, and even in my shop, a lot of our developers were not always thinking about tuning, and like since I've gotten so many dividends on just basic tuning, so like just basic like Sargable, making sure you're making use of indexes, just basic stuff. I'm like, wow, I could really level up if I learn more about how that works and pages and leaves and all that stuff. So I'm trying to learn more. So I signed up for the class because I mean I have the books, but at the same time I think it's good to. So anyway, long story short, I'm setting up my own home instance of it, and it's 40 to 100 gigabytes of like the Stack Overflow database I'm setting up, and I'm running a query like one, and it's like 28 seconds or so, and I'm like, is my little machine powerful enough, or I'm kind of like, because he kind of suggests to get a VM, and I'm like, I think my computer's new enough that I don't necessarily need a VM. I have 64 gigs, but not 128. But so I was just curious, like, if you're gonna do some moderate, this is not enterprise. This is one instance. That is a computer that does other things, but it's pretty modern. It's 11th gen chip with 64 gigs.
So Tracy, what are your thoughts?
I did a VM in the cloud, but I cheat and I have MVP credits, so
I use
And
my
the-
laptop, Mike, for anything that I want to learn. I mean,
And then-
it certainly depends on what you want to learn. But yeah, as long as it's not something terribly performance intensive, an ordinary laptop works fine for me. That's my 2 cents. Sorry, Tracy, didn't mean to cut you off.
I can't remember how much memory my laptop has. I think my laptop has 32 gigs of memory, so I do have stuff on there that I do use. I do have a local instance of SQL on there that I have some stuff on, but nothing that big.
Yeah, it seems to be working fine, and I beefed my laptop up a little bit. Don't tell anybody.
I use a HP laptop that I bought for $600 on Amazon. It works fine for me for the kind of stuff that I want to learn.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, I think I should be all right. And
Right.
I'm not against getting the VM like you suggest, because he's trying. I think when it gets more advanced, it's going to be some stuff that is like simulating a backup, or I don't know. I'll tell you when I get there. We'll have more topics. But
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on the topic. One is that the virtual machine approach can be useful because all right, well, you can shut the thing off. And if you're not doing performance tuning very often or for very long, then it's going to be less expensive than dedicating an entire machine to running this, to essentially having a server. So if you already have the equipment, yeah, sure, roll with it. Also, it's going to depend a lot on what your intended purpose is. You know, there are some bits of performance tuning where you do need a certain amount of data. You must be this tall to ride the ride. So as an example of that, if you want to try out, for example, a merry-go-round scan, well, you have to have a query which is going to scan through enough data so that your second query can come in and scan through the data so that they kind of match up on each other. And you need enough processes that are doing this so that you can actually see a practical difference in the results and in times for queries. So to set one of those scenarios up, you know, you need enough hardware to be able to hammer it with enough data to be able to scan through it. In a lot of other cases, you can mimic certain types of performance degradation. A classic example that Kendra Little had was, I want to mimic network traffic, you know, working on a slow network. So put the database files on a USB 2 drive. That's going to be really slow network traffic or emulate really slow network traffic because, you know, USB 2 is pretty doggone slow. So you basically cap out how much data can be sent back and forth. And that way, if you're running on a crummy network, then the types of things that you do on this machine will perhaps help you more than the types of things you would do if you have everything on NVMe, locally attached storage, on your laptop or on your desktop. If you do want to see how can I make things really fast, and especially when I have enormous sets of data, you know, how do I get this close to a realistic production scenario? Then that's where Tracy's advice of Azure Server makes a whole lot of sense. You can try to get to as close of a match to an actual production server as you're able to. It also gives you an idea to work with things that are outside of SQL Server. There are things outside of SQL Server that matter a lot. Going back to the good old days, you know, you have things like TCP chimney. You have configuration settings on Windows Server itself. You have firewall settings, power settings on machines. You have BIOS settings, things that you might have some control over. And to the extent that you have control over it, it may be outside of SQL Server, and you may not understand exactly what the ramifications of it are until you actually have to test it. This is also where you might want to have it be in a VM so that you could set up Active Directory. That way you could have, you know, your AD controller, you could have your SQL Server instance, and work with a few of those machines if you really want to get that whole administrative experience without actually, you know, testing it out in your company's production environment.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as I've learned little bits and pieces, like just small things like a 5V cable only does 1 gigabyte per second, and you know, and that some ports can do 2.5, some can do 5, some can do 10, and if you have the right hardware, you can take advantage of that. But if you don't know that, you know, like, just, I mean, that's only one small example. You guys know way more than I do, but or just, I was using VPN. My computer's fast, but I'm on VPN and it's capped to 100. It's 1/10 of what I'm paying for it, you know, for internet. So yeah, that makes sense that there's other factors at play. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. So does someone sell, like with a network setup, a set of hardware for tuning a SQL server? This is a marketplace. This is a niche in other marketplaces. Short answer, not hardware. It's more of wetware. You know, in a lot of cases, this is people. It's people, it's scripts, it's process. Now, that stated, there are things like, for example, if you're running in Azure, there are Azure advisories where, hey, did you know that if you did this thing, you might be able to get better performance? That you're running on slower disks than what we recommend. That you're running at a lower number of CPU cores than what we recommend for a SQL Server. That these queries could be tuned. That these queries, you may be missing indexes on them. So there's a lot of rules engines like that. But then you still have the idea of, I need a person to go through this and make sure that it actually makes sense. But it's not hardware. It's definitely more of software and people. Although, Tracy, Mala, if you want to contradict me on that, go for it.
Actually, I think your example was brilliant and I fully agree.
P3.
Good. The bribes went through. Thanks to Raid Shadow Legends.
Well, I missed the bribe. Where's it at? I didn't get a bribe.
Oh, it's in the mail.
It's in the. It's.
I think the
gotta
cat
set
got
your
it.
transaction level.
She's right here. She didn't get a bribe either.
She's just not telling you.
Snapshot read only. Sorry.
She ate all the treats already. Darn.
That will happen. That'll happen. Now, our last topic for the night comes from Tracy. So it's a good thing everybody else was here on Shop Talk, because I didn't have any topics today. Remembering the basics. What do we do to keep track of the basics? And that could be, we could take this really broad. Like, how do I remember when I'm troubleshooting a problem that maybe I should look at this thing? So I think, Tracy, you mentioned power plans. That, yeah, it could be something as simple as a performance problem being caused by you put the power plan on battery saver mode, even though you're running a server that's not running on a battery, because this isn't a laptop.
Yeah, it's just like, I've been doing SQL Server for, okay, I'm old, 23 years. So
now we know
and you
Tracy's
go to
25 years
companies-
old.
You go into companies and you got a fleet of senior DBAs, and you switch to another team, and you're noticing things like power plans in balance mode and such things, and you're just like, golly, what's all the different things you set?
Well, it's funny you say that. I remember listening to a podcast or something, and I told Kevin about this, but like, these programmers had a major issue with the database, and they went to a SQL Server expert, and there was some setting called like compound on grow or something like that, and they, none of the developers knew. It was like a nuanced thing that we all should know as you all should know. So yeah,
percentage growth on transaction log growth.
Yeah, that was set in the wrong setting.
Don't get me started on my TempDB that's got percentages set for the auto growth. That's one of the things I want to change. But yeah, that's one thing. And then making sure IFI is turned on, ad hoc, optimized for ad hoc workloads, the max stop being set, just the list. I'm trying to think of everything that I can check now, because I've noticed the 6 or 7 things here. I'm like, am I remembering everything?
Yeah, it's cool, but I mean, a checklist might be a good thing.
I use a checklist. No matter how old I get, I will never grow out of checklists.
I can't find my checklist. I don't know which thingy I saved it on.
That can be a problem. And yeah, you can offload some of those ideas to tools, third-party tools, DBA checks. I think Tracy's familiar with that.
Yeah, I ran that on there. I wrote a bunch of code for it.
Having written a bunch of code for it, yeah, exactly. DBA checks, DBA tools, SP Blitz. There are third-party checklists that people have put together and released as here, freely available. Here's what I do. So I think on the administrative
Microsoft has
side,
one now too, built into I think SSMS 18.1. I want to say they released something.
What have they built into it, Tracy? I don't know about
The SQL API assessment or something like that.
yeah, yes, exactly. The SQL Assessment API.
SQL Assessment API. Oh, I need to understand.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of tools. It's just like, I wish I had
What does that API do? What does it do?
It
So-
assesses for best practices that Microsoft has,
Right.
defined.
Right.
Oh.
Primarily, it's around vulnerability assessment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Security vulnerability assessment. Okay.
Yeah, that's what it's mostly for, but it's not. It doesn't just include vulnerability assessments. Think of it as an on-premises version similar to what the Azure Advisor does.
Oh, I see. Okay. Got you.
So trying to get you toward solid practices and principles,
Uh-huh.
in part so that they can get you up into Azure. But
DBA Clippy.
But there's just so many different things, and then there's places that don't let you use like DBA checks and
That is
SP
true.
Blitz.
and in those
And-
scenarios, there are workarounds, but sometimes it's just okay. You're not going to let me do this thing. I will run each of the individual queries myself. I'm going to charge you 15 times, 150
You're an
times
employee.
as much
I'm not
money.
gonna get charged. I'm not gonna charge them anything.
Well, if you're an employee, okay, yeah, but coming as a
I'm
consultant,
gonna waste X number of weeks.
yeah, seriously, it's like, look, I can run this script, and it's going to take me 20 seconds to run the script, maybe even 5 seconds to run the script, and then I'll take an hour, 2 hours to analyze the results and remediate, however many hours that takes. Or you can have me run each one of these scripts individually, each one of these processes individually in here, which is going to take probably about 150 times as long, and it's going to take the same amount of time to remediate. You can pay me a lot more money to do copy paste work. I'm okay with that. It just doesn't seem like a good use of your time and money.
Yeah, because I can write a script using DBA tools and install SP Blitz and have because I have SMS, the central management server, and I'm all registered, and have it all put back into one table in 6 lines of code.
Yep,
And
pretty much.
analyze all the servers at once and figure out the pattern of, hey, we don't do this on anything. By the way, torn page detection should not be none.
Nope. Checksum only. Checksum
So all I
only.
got to say about that setting.
Automation of software is how we got into the 21st century. Yeah, but I'm not going to hold that against automation of software.
No, this is just these databases have been upgraded over time, and then the defaults that have been way back when have been just progressed along the way.
Carried forward.
And nobody
Wants to be the person to be like, "Ooh,
settings.
let's change that." Yeah.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, people who don't know or it's running just fine.
So, but yeah, it's just knowing what those best practices are these days. It's just it's hard to remember when you've been doing it so long, and you come into places that already have them in place, and you don't have to worry about it. And then you go into some place and it's there's so much.
Yep. Well, best practices also change. 10 years ago, optimized for ad hoc workloads was, sure, turn it on automatically. Worst case, it's not going to help. Best case, it does help. And now, I think Randolph West and Eric Darling have gone a long way towards showing actually optimized for ad hoc workloads is almost never a good idea. And it does come with its downsides, mostly in the inability to understand plans that come as a result. So it's interesting to see some of that advice changing over the years to where, oh, yeah, maybe I should think about whether or not I need to do this. Or index fragmentation. How often do I need to rebuild? How often do I need to reorganize? Which is never. But how often do I need to rebuild? Well, some of that advice has changed based on the fact that we're not running on single spinning disk anymore.
We don't
So-
have Rust anymore.
Yeah. As soon as you start moving to large numbers of disks, or you start moving to solid state to NVMe, the cost of rebuild in many cases can be way more expensive than the benefit you get from rebuild. And there's a Jeff Moden presentation from a couple years ago that's on the TriPass channel that goes into much detail on the topic.
2 of them.
Yeah, that's
Jeff?
true.
It was a 2-part series.
This is the
It was-
defrag thing.
Or did he do them together?
No, it was separate because the first one
Brain
was
meltdown?
it was they were both very long in a good way.
Yeah.
So went into a whole lot of detail, covered a lot of topic, and dove into the topic quite well. So absolutely worth checking that out and maybe revisiting it if it's been a little while, because I think you get a whole lot out of it, and a whole lot more than let's rebuild all indexes at 20% fragmentation.
Yeah, because I know at my last job I did put a blog post out of like the top 10 things that drive a DBA crazy, and it was like 10 settings that should always be set. Or things that should always be done, like check DB,
Yep.
please check for corruption. So
That is
Oh my
important.
gosh! One day we could do, like, when I'm made more progress on mine, you could audit it and be like the horror. It'll be like a takedown episode.
Because I did that based on the last job I had the same thing where I was going through just different settings and stuff. Every place you go, I've had this, issue for the past few jobs where I've had to go in and just do the basic stuff, and I keep, reliving the basics.
I was thinking of you because I did a basic install and I was like, I guarantee I'm not supposed to do this. It was like press this button and install, or
Right.
do a custom install, and I was like, oof, I have a feeling I'm not supposed to do this.
So we're gonna wrap up for the
And
evening.
he's on our board.
Mike is the most advanced DBA we have. He's
How
successfully
did
installed.
he get voted on?
No competition. That's how I do it.
Mike took out all the competition. There were dozens of people in the field.
I'm on the board of a knitting club as well. Pretty random
Now
fun.
those
I'm on the board of a foster charity.
knitting clubs are serious business, though.
Actually, that's true. Yeah, I would never get on one of those.
So I'm going to close this out with Mike's comment here that I can remember the meetings when we assumed in a few years we'd have HLL and did everything. We wouldn't need programmers. Managers could simply tell the computer what was needed. Yeah, Rational Rose called and they still want to sell you their product. So on that topic, we are going to wrap up for the evening. Thanks everybody for sticking around, and remember that tomorrow we do have our data science business intelligence meeting, so stay tuned for that, and until we see each other again, take care.